So today we'll be talking about Skulls in the Stars, which is the second Solomon Kane story. And it's extremely short. It's just two very short chapters. It's about 6 to 8 pages on the Kindle. And it very much has a supernatural vibe.
Mm.
You could imagine Sam and Dean Winchester trying to deal with this problem.
Yes, it has a very similar solution as well. That
It does.
someone done wrong.
Yes. The
monster was man all along.
Yeah. So it opens with Solomon Kane leaving a town that he's just been to, and then this barefaced youth comes up to him and says, "Sir, don't go that way." And there's two ways to lead the town by. There's the swamp, and there's the moors. And you're not meant to go through the moors because the moors are haunted. So even though the swamp's gross and unpleasant, you're meant to avoid them.
And the moors are much shorter. Is a much shorter route.
Yeah. And when Solomon Kane hears about this, he immediately gets the spirit of adventure in him, and he wants to go have fun fighting whatever
ghastly monster
haunts the moors. But there's another interesting point here where Howard, the author, says, but Kane did not recognize his feelings as such. He didn't recognize the fact that he was hungering for adventure, and so he thought, yes, I'll go fight whatever ghostly thing is out on the moors. He just felt it. He interpreted his feelings as being, I have to go fight evil. But really it was like, oh boy, here it comes, oh boy, this will be fun.
Yes, that carried over from the previous story, the theme of Kane not being aware of his own motivations,
being more primal and, wild than...
He's not very self-aware.
Yeah.
I had a real Hound of the Baskervilles vibe about the spooky moors at night.
Yes, for sure. Yeah, here's the quote actually. Far back in Kane's gloomy eyes, a scintillant light had begun to glimmer, like a witch's torch glinting under fathoms of cold grey ice. His blood quickened. Adventure, the lure of life, risk and drama. Not that Kane recognised his sensations as such. He sincerely considered he voiced his real feelings when he said, "These things be deeds of some power of evil. The lords of darkness have laid a curse upon the country. A strong man is needed to combat Satan in his might. Therefore I go, who have defied him many a time."
This was something I was thinking about. It's very interesting. What's the author's name? Robert E. Howard.
Yeah.
Writing about a religious man when he was an atheist, because he definitely views it very psychologically, and he focuses on the psychology of Solomon Kane, and Solomon Kane doesn't describe him as having any kind of external experience of the divine. So he's trying to attribute the behaviour of someone who is actually... I think he accurately describes his behaviour, but he might not... If you read the writings of a religious fanatic, they definitely will not line up with what he's describing his internal life to be, which is interesting. That he can't quite... He's accurately describing what he's like, but he can't quite get inside that psychology because he doesn't have experience of it himself. So there's I think a lack of empathy in a way, that he can't fully understand someone like that. So I think he's saying that Solomon Kane doesn't understand himself, but I think it's Robert E. Howard who doesn't actually understand Solomon Kane.
Yeah. He definitely ascribes Solomon Kane to being fundamentally misunderstanding himself. That's the point he's trying to make, which the final story, Wings in the Night, I believe it's called, will really dive into that.
Right.
I'm looking forward to reading Wings in the Night. I think that'll be really interesting. And Wings in the Night also has a particular quote, which is very interesting. I think anyone who's read Wings of the Night will probably know what phrase I'm referring to when I say it's the real controversial one. But
because in this story, it's saying essentially how Solomon Kane, if we go a little bit forward, is able to defeat the ghost.
Yeah, so I'll probably just describe what happens next briefly. So he's going along on the moors, trying to find whatever this thing is. When it appears, there's lots of vivid Lovecraftian descriptions about how horrifying and otherworldly and terrifying and ghastly and the ghost is.
Very spooky. I liked the description
Truly
of it,
spooky.
how it was immaterial and ghostly, and you just pass through it except for its claws.
Yeah.
Ooh.
Yeah, it's a clawed horror, and it assails him and starts to tear at him, and
it's just killed another traveller who's coming.
Oh yeah, that's a good point. I've forgotten about that. So as he hears it killing someone else, and he hears the person running away and trying to escape, and then being torn apart, and he thinks to himself, "Not going to happen to me, buddy boy." And so he doesn't run away from it. He stands his ground, and as the creature starts to tear and slash at him,
I won't be stabbed in the back. I'll be stabbed in the front.
Yeah, he doesn't try and use his sword because he knows it's just a ghost. So he just flails at it with his fist and tries to grapple with it. And there's a bit of this isn't a very good comparison, but it's the only one that comes to mind right now. But who did God wrestle with in the Old Testament?
I was just thinking of that.
Oh,
Jacob.
Really? Jacob.
Yes.
Yeah.
Or Israel, depending on which name.
Because this ghost is slashing at him, but is also incorporeal. So it can damage him with impunity, and he can do no physical damage to it whatsoever. But because he's got such an iron will and ferocious heart that will never give in or feel fear or terror, he's able to just keep wailing on it until the ghost gets weaker and weaker, and then it goes, ah!
Yeah, it mentions in the story the ghost is a manifestation of hate, and Solomon Kane is able to fight it because he's by manifesting courage.
Yes.
Yeah, and this is another thing that.
Yes, here's the quote. And that one was enough to overcome the others. For if abstract hate may bring into material substance a ghostly thing, may not courage, equally abstract, form a concrete weapon to combat the ghost? Cain fought with his arms and his feet and his hands, and he was aware at last the ghost began to give back before him, and the fearful slaughter changed to screams of baffled fury. The man's only weapon is courage that flinches not from the gates of hell itself, and against such not even the legions of hell can stand.
Yes, now this is exactly illustrating my point about Robert E. Howard not understanding Solomon Kane.
Yeah.
Because a real Puritan fanatic would have prayed through that, whereas Solomon Kane doesn't. It's like Solomon Kane believed in himself. He thinks he believes in God, but he actually
believes in himself. Yes.
Yes. So that's what I mean about Robert E. Howard. He sees a man fearlessly facing down demonic forces without flinching, and I think this man he admires that. He sees someone.
He sees a Nietzschean Übermensch. That's what he sees.
Yes, but he doesn't actually understand inside the psychology of someone like that.
Yeah. So yes, that's a great point. So Solomon Kane believes himself to be a simple man granted the power and will to do what he has to do through God. And Robert E. Howard psychoanalyzes him and says, no, it's really his internal will and his primal thirst for adventure and being the best that is able to carry him through all these things.
Yeah, so it's projection. He's not actually understanding someone else's experience.
Yeah. Which, even if he's wrong, I still think it's an interesting thing. But I think you're quite right. So the ghost begins to, while it's attacking him and then starts to be driven back, it's gabbling and garbling and some unknown gibberish sounds. But even though Solomon Kane doesn't understand them as words, he begins to kind of somehow understand what the creature's trying to say. And then in chapter 2, or the second part of this very short story, he leads the villagers back into the swamp where Ezra the miser, yes, is living, and
Misers used to turn up a lot in old stories.
they did.
Horatio Alger loved to
Misers all the time. Yes.
It always had like a side character who
Yes.
was a miser.
Yes, the miser was one of the eternally reoccurring characters that all of his like copy and paste stories would have.
Yeah,
There'd be a
who would
miser in
have
them. Yeah.
piles of gold on the floorboards and would be living on gruel and
Yes.
dry bread.
And it turns out that this miser Ezra had a young cousin Gideon, who was a maniac, and this Ezra character killed him.
Yeah, because he was afraid that Gideon would tell everyone about how abusive Ezra was being to him.
Yes.
I also, just to go back, I really like the description of the house, of Ezra's house.
Yeah.
And also feeding into the description of Ezra himself.
Very good quote. I will read that out actually, because it is a very evocative prose of which Robert E. Howard is very good at. The hut of old Ezra the miser stood by the road in the midst of the swamp, half screened by the sullen trees which grew about it. The wall were rotting, the roof crumbling, and great pallid and green fungus monsters clung to it and writhed about the doors and windows, as if seeking to peer within. The trees leaned above it, and their grey branches intertwined, so that it crouched in semi-darkness, like a monstrous dwarf over whose shoulder ogres lair.
Mm.
And then, to skip forward a bit to the description of Ezra. Old Ezra the miser partook much of the quality of the swamp, but he was gnarled and bent and sullen. His fingers were like clutching parasitic plants, and his locks hung like drab moss above eyes trained to the murk of the swamplands. His eyes were like a dead man's, yet hinted of depths abysmal and loathsome, as the dead lakes of the swamplands.
Ew.
Yes, not exactly a noble character that's portrayed very well at all. Quite the opposite, in fact. He's again, this is the kind of thing which would be, I'm not exactly sure, but I feel like there's a tendency in modern storytelling against having an evil, despicable character, described in great detail, how every single aspect of him is gross and awful.
There's not any sympathy for Ezra. He is
100% evil. And he knew that the ghost of Gideon would try and take revenge on him, so he went to the moor and hid his bones in a ruined tree, so that the ghost would not haunt where he was. And so Solomon Kane has the villagers tie him to the tree and leave him there for the ghost to get his vengeance.
Yes, it's pretty. Yes, because the ghost is Gideon.
Yes.
Or get Gideon's shadow maybe.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it's I think we'll be comparing Solomon Kane a lot to Conan throughout this, but with Conan you have Crom, who gives men the strength they need at birth and then has nothing more to do with them.
You just hope that he leaves you alone.
Yes, you just want him to not think about you or interact with you in any way, because it's always going to be bad. And so Crom never helps Conan out at all, and Conan doesn't want him to do anything, to help him out in any way or to be involved in his life in any way.
Yes, Conan lives his life as an atheist, even though he...
Whereas Solomon Kane has exactly the opposite, of where he feels directly inspired by God and feels like an agent of God's will in the world. In pretty much exactly the opposite way to Conan. And we've got more of Kane's talk about religion here. Life was good to him, though he was gnarled and churlish and evil, Kane sighed. Mayhap God has a place for such souls, where fire and sacrifice may cleanse them of their dross, as fire cleans the forest or fungus things. Yet my heart is heavy within me. Nay, sir, one of the villagers spoke. You have done but the will of God, and God alone shall come, and good alone shall come of this night's deed. Nay, answered Kane heavily, I know not, I know not. The sun had gone down at night, sped with amazing swiftness, as the great shadows came rushing down from unknown voids, to cloak the world with hurrying darkness. Through the thick night came a weird echo, and the men halted and looked back the way they had come. So again, similarly with the Solomon Kane as a secret, like, Ubermensch, Nietzschean pagan type, which he doesn't quite realise himself. There's an interesting dichotomy where he has this unshakable will, sort of in the pursuit of evil and in fighting the bad guys, but yet when it comes to moral choices, he often has difficulty. Like we saw back in the previous story with tracking down Lelou, with all the treasure that Lelou and the bandits had gotten, he gave it out. He gave it to all the villagers, and Lelou mocks them for saying, "Oh, they're just going to tear each other apart, trying to over the treasure you gave them." And he's like, "Yeah, that's probably true, but still your fault. It's really hurting my conscience that happened."
Yes, he couldn't think of anything better to do, so that's what he did.
Yes, so he has a bit. He does sometimes have difficulties knowing what the right thing to do is, which is interesting.
Yeah, I think he is. I liked this story a bit more supernatural elements and digging into his more of his religiosity. It was interesting. I felt a lot more that he was described as an inquisitor type person going out and...
Yeah, well, Solomon Kane has had a huge amount of influence on the motif of like the fantasy witch hunter type.
Yes. With
the black cloak and the Puritan hat and going out, which is an interesting... I think
people often confuse it with Van Helsing.
Yes, they do. The popular image of Van Helsing is kind of based on Solomon Kane in a weird way, which was... There was a movie with Hugh Jackman called Helsing or Van Helsing, I've forgotten which, but he was basically looked and acted exactly like Solomon Kane. But it's a little funny thing that there's this sort of confusion and meshing of concepts with the Puritan and the Inquisitor, the Catholic Christian extremist and the Protestant, and then they kind of get meshed together into this kind of hybrid thing, which is probably exemplified most by the Inquisition in Warhammer 40,000.
But it's a lot more Catholic, I feel, than...
Yeah, but the way they tend to be dressed is very Solomon Kane-y.
Yes.
In that Puritan garb kind of thing. Yeah, it's interesting. And then of course that sort of tied in with the idea of the sort of New England witch burning sort of thing as well. Yes.
Yeah, so what I just realised is that all of Solomon Kane's motivations are very internal, whereas there's none of that relational or even if you are an atheist, there's still, for religious experience, there's still perceived external motivation.
Yes, that's a good point.
So he never talks about Solomon Kane perceiving that he's been given direction or motivation or comfort or direction by an external force, or reaching out to try and
he doesn't seem to take any time to mention Solomon Kane praying before in the morning or before bed or anything,
or even in moments of crisis.
No, he just grits his teeth and
yes,
goes through it like a Mayon.
Yes, so that's where I think that Robert E. Howard is accurately describing how virtue is performed, but doesn't understand
where it comes from. Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. Well, again, that was a very short story, so I don't think we've got much more to say about it. But we'll be moving to Germany and a mysterious inn for the next one.
Ooh.
Rattle of Bones.
Oh, that is a good name.
Yeah, so look forward to that one.
Okay.